What if everything you thought you knew about history, especially, Russian history, wasn't quite right? What if it was more like an illusion?
It's a fascinating premise. Imagine a theory that suggests a huge single empire existed where we usually see lots of separate warring groups.
Exactly. And that's what we're diving into today. It's one of the most uh, provocative historical theories out there, the new chronology.
Proposed by the Russian mathematicians Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nosovsky.
Right. They argue that a lot of what we call ancient history is actually just a sort of phantom reflection, a misdating of events that really happened much later.
Specifically between the 10th and 16th centuries AD, it flips the timeline completely.
And you've shared the source material from their book 14, The Issue with Russian Tartary.
Mm.
So our mission here is to pull out the key ideas, the main insights from this material.
We'll explore their claims, the evidence they point to, and, how it stacks up against mainstream history, all based strictly on the sources provided.
So get ready. Your understanding of the past might get a serious shakeup.
It definitely challenges conventional thinking.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. What's the absolute core idea of this new chronology presented in their history, fiction, or science series? What kicks things off?
Well, their central point is that the standard historical timeline, what they call the Scaligerine chronology, is fundamentally flawed, especially anything before the 11th century.
Flawed how? Like just inaccurate dates?
More than that, they argue that major events and even entire civilizations we place in antiquity, think Rome, Greece, Egypt, actually happened much later, during the Middle Ages, really.
And the ancient accounts are, what, duplicates?
Phantom reflections, as they put it. Misinterpreted or duplicated accounts of real events that occurred between roughly 1000 and 1500 AD.
Okay, that's already huge. But then they introduce this concept of a massive empire.
Yes, a vast Slav-Turk-Russian horde empire. They believe this single entity dominated Eurasia before the 17th century.
And this is where it gets really radical with identities, right? They lump together groups we normally see as distinct.
Exactly. Scythians, Huns, Goths, Bulgars, Mongols, Cossacks. In their view, these weren't separate peoples in the way we think. They were all just components, different parts of this one massive Russian horde.
Wow. So how do they claim to prove something so counterintuitive? What's their method?
They put a huge emphasis on using mathematical, statistical, and astronomical methods. They literally say their work contains irrefutable evidence from these fields.
So they're claiming a kind of scientific certainty for these historical reinterpretations.
That's the claim, yes.
Yeah.
That this data provides objective proof for their views, setting it apart from traditional historical analysis.
But of course, the academic world sees it very differently. How does mainstream history respond to this?
Overwhelmingly negatively. The new chronology is widely, almost universally regarded as pseudo-history within academia.
What are the main objections? Is the math, the history?
It's multifaceted. Critics argue it's completely inconsistent with established dating methods, like carbon dating or dendrochronology. They accuse Fomenko of cherry-picking sources, only using data that fits his theory and ignoring anything that contradicts it.
Okay.
And they point to what they call force pattern matching, essentially manipulating historical data like rearranging reigns or merging different historical figures. They mention combining Jesus and Pope Gregory VII as an example to create statistical correlations that aren't really there.
So the core methodology is heavily disputed.
Absolutely. Plus, there's the underlying implication of a massive conspiracy that history was deliberately falsified on a grand scale before the 17th century.
Right. We'll definitely come back to that. But first, let's look at how they apply this to Russia itself. They start redrawing the map, don't they? Relocating famous cities.
They do. One of the most startling claims is about Novgorod the Great. They argue that the historical city wasn't the modern Novgorod upon Volkhov,
But rather,
Yaroslavl.
Yaroslav. Why Yaroslav? What's their reasoning?
They point to several things. First, Yaroslavl was apparently the second biggest city in 17th century Russia after Moscow. Huge.
Yeah.
Second, its fortifications were incredibly strong. We're talking 24 towers, some apparently comparable in size to the Kremlin's towers in Moscow. This suggests major importance.
And wasn't there something about a library?
Yes, a significant cultural center, too. They mention a lavish library in Yaroslavl in the early 13th century holding about 1,000 Greek books.
which is quite a collection for that period.
Definitely. So Fomenko and Nosovsky find it suspicious that conventional or Romanovian history seems to draw a blank on Yaroslavl's early history before the 17th century. They see this impenetrable veil of darkness as evidence that its real ancient history was deliberately artificially removed and basically transplanted onto the modern Novgorod.
And this connects somehow to Ivan the Terrible's famous lost library.
It does. The traditional story is that Ivan's huge royal library in Moscow disappeared, maybe burned, maybe stolen. But Fomenko and Nosovsky have a different idea. They hypothesize it wasn't destroyed in Moscow, but transferred.
To Yaroslavl, their true Novgorod.
Exactly. They suggest Tsar Simeon moved it there. And then they take this even further.
How so?
They speculate that this library might actually be the legendary Library of Alexandria.
Wait, the Library of Alexandria? In Yaroslavl? How does that work?
Well, it ties into their larger claim that biblical Egypt was actually Russia, or the Horde, in the 14th to 16th centuries. It's a radical connection.
So if this library was Alexandria, and it was in Yaroslavl, what happened to it?
They suggest it was likely burned, deliberately destroyed by the first Romanov Tsars in the 17th century.
Why?
To erase the history of the Horde, to erase Russia's connection to that supposed ancient, powerful past that the Romanovs wanted to overwrite.
This idea of erasing history extends beyond libraries and cities, doesn't it? They talk about Astrakhan, too.
Yes, the vanishing city of Astrakhan. They highlight what they call an amazing fact. The old Tartar city of Astrakhan, or Sitrikhan, was a major trading hub on the right bank of the Volga River.
Okay, and modern Astrakhan?
It's about 9 versts, that's roughly 9 or 10 kilometers downstream, and on the left bank.
So a completely different location. What does conventional history say happened?
The Romanov version is that the old city was transferred and demolished in 1556 by Ivan Chermisanov after the Russian conquest.
But Fomenko and Nosovsky question this.
They suggest this kind of raising out of existence of entire cities might have happened later, maybe in the 17th century, as part of that broader effort by the Romanovs to rewrite history and eliminate traces of the older Tartar or Horde civilization.
Erasing cities, moving libraries. What about maps? Did they find evidence of tampering there too?
They did. They focus on Ivan Kirillov, an 18th century Russian cartographer. He apparently created around 360 maps.
I was suspicious about them.
Specifically, his general map of the Russian Empire from 1734. They point out that it conspicuously lacked any mention of Muscovite Tartary.
Muscovite Tartary, what was that supposed to be?
Well, compare Kirillov's map to one published just a few decades later in the 1771 Encyclopedia Britannica. That map showed Muscovite Tartary, clearly labeled.
And it was significant.
According to that Britannica map, it was the world's largest state, with its capital in Tobolsk, Siberia.
So a huge discrepancy between two 18th century maps. How do Fomenko and Nosovsky explain this?
They conclude that Kirillov's maps, especially the general map, must have been deliberately suppressed or destroyed by order of the imperial court.
Why? To hide the existence of Muscovite Tartary.
Precisely. To eliminate traces of what they see as an independent, possibly hostile state Muscovite Tartary, which, in their theory, was the true heir of the old Russian horde. It fits the pattern of systematically erasing the pre-Romanov past.
So they've redrawn the map, relocated cities.
Yeah.
How did they reinterpret the people themselves, the identities, the titles?
They make some really bold claims here. Take titles like Kagan and Caliph. We usually associate those with Turkic or Islamic rulers, right?
Right.
Fomenko and Nosovsky assert these titles were actually used by Russian, or as they often frame it, Mongolian emperors and high priests.
Russian Kagans and Caliphs.
Yes. And they go further, identifying specific historical figures as being the same person. For instance, they claim Ivan Kalita, a well-known Russian czar, was actually the same historical personality as Batu Khan, the Mongol leader, and the legendary Christian king Prester John, and someone they call Ivan the Caliph.
Wow. Merging figures across completely different cultures and historical narratives. How do they justify linking Kalita and Kelis, for instance?
They point to the linguistic similarity, Kalita, Khalifa. They see it as evidence of a shared, unified origin for these powerful roles within their proposed horde empire.
Okay, that's a huge leap. And it ties into their redefinition of the Mongols themselves, right? Challenging that whole savage nomad image.
Absolutely. That's a really crucial part of their argument. They directly counter the traditional image.
How? What evidence do they use?
They highlight numerous dynastic marriages recorded between supposedly Mongolian Khans and Byzantine princesses.
Okay.
Their point is, Such high-level intermarriage implies shared culture, shared religion, or at least significant diplomatic and cultural parity. Not the kind of relationship you'd expect between savage nomads and the sophisticated Byzantine court.
So they're suggesting the Mongols weren't nomadic barbarians.
Exactly. They go so far as to explicitly state that groups like the Khazars and the Mongols were in fact Orthodox Russians.
Orthodox Russians.
Yeah.
But the Mongols are traditionally seen as pagan or shamanistic before adopting other faiths.
Right. This leads Fomenko and Nosovsky to an even more radical theory, that Orthodox Christianity and Islam were actually once united, or much closer than we think. Yes, possibly even facets of the same broader religious system within the Horde. They suggest the major schism between them only occurred relatively late, maybe in the 15th or 16th century. This completely rewrites the history of these major world religions.
That's paradigm shifting, to say the least.
Yeah.
And they also reinterpret the word horde itself.
They do. We tend to hear horde and immediately think of, well, hordes, wild, undisciplined masses, nomads.
Like the Golden Horde, the Mongol Horde.
Right. But Fomenko and Nosovsky argue that this is a later misinterpretation. They claim that as recently as the 17th century, the word orda, or horde, in Russian and related languages, simply meant army or troops.
Just army.
Yes. And they say it wasn't just used for Tartar or Mongol forces. It was apparently used as a general term, even referring to German and Swedish armies at the time.
So if horde just means army, the Golden Horde becomes the Golden Army.
Precisely. It completely changes the connotation, stripping away the savage nomad image and presenting it more like a regular military or political entity.
And this reevaluation of identities continues. What about Kiev?
They claim Kiev was the capital of the Goths.
The Goths, as in the Germanic people who sacked Rome.
The very same. But then they equate the Goths with the Cossacks.
Goths, Cossacks.
That's their assertion. They state this identification is known well to everyone, which is definitely not the mainstream view.
And how do they support Kiev being the Gothic capital?
They point to its appearance on ancient maps attributed to Ptolemy. But crucially, they argue these maps aren't from the 2nd century AD as conventionally dated, but actually from the 13th to 16th centuries AD.
Fitting neatly into their revised timeline again.
Exactly. It places Gothic Cossack Kiev within the time frame of their Russian horde.
Okay, so we have different titles, different identities.
Okay.
What about language? Did this unified horde empire have a unified language?
They suggest it did, or at least that the languages were much more closely related than we think. They draw heavily on the account of Plano Carpini, the 13th century papal envoy we mentioned earlier.
What did Carpini say about language?
Well, when describing a letter, a missive, sent from the Great Khan to the Pope, Carpini apparently recorded that it was written in. Well, the quote they use is, the language of the Russians, the Saracens, or the Tartars.
Implying those were interchangeable, or perhaps even the same language.
That's exactly how Fomenko and Nosovsky interpret it, a strong hint towards linguistic unity within the horde.
Does Carpini mention a distinct Mongolian language?
That's the other key point they make. According to them, Carpini's detailed account of his travels makes no mention of a separate, distinct Mongolian language being spoken at the Khan's court or used in writing.
Which would be odd if the rulers were ethnically distinct Mongols speaking a unique language.
Extremely odd. For Fomenko and Nosovsky, this silence speaks volumes. It suggests the Mongolian Khans were literate and communicated primarily in Russian, or this broader Slav-Turkic language, further supporting their idea of a unified empire, not separate ethnic groups.
This theme of historical erasure, it isn't just about missing maps or dodgy documents for them, is it? They claim there's actual physical evidence of tampering.
Yes, they point to specific artifacts. A really striking example is in Kiev in the St. Sophia Cathedral. It's the sarcophagus traditionally identified as belonging to Yaroslavl the Wise, a famous Kievan prince.
What's unusual about it?
One entire side of this massive stone coffin has had its artwork and any lettering completely chiseled off, just smoothed away. But the other sides are intact, showing the original carvings.
Why would someone do that? What's their interpretation?
They see it as a clear sign of later tampering, likely by the Romanovs. A deliberate act to obscure the sarcophagus's original identity and repurpose it to fit their new, fabricated history of Russia.
So they think it wasn't Yaroslavl's originally?
Possibly. They suggest it might have been an anonymous sarcophagus, or perhaps one with inscriptions, maybe even in Arabic, fitting their horde theory that were deliberately removed.
And wasn't there something odd about the contents, too?
Yes, they mention peculiar accounts from museum staff, suggesting it was actually a much older Byzantine coffin, maybe from the 4th century AD, and apparently it contained not one, but multiple skeletons, a male, a female, and a child.
Multiple skeletons.
Which led to the idea it was basically a second-hand coffin used for the prince. All very strange, and for Fomenko and Nosovsky, it points away from the official story.
So, a potentially recycled, deliberately defaced coffin. And they argue this wasn't just a one-off incident.
Not at all. They describe what they call the barbaric destruction of historical markers elsewhere. They mention old headstones being destroyed at the Staro-Simonov Monastery in Moscow as recently as the 1960s.
Okay.
And damage to sarcophagi in another Moscow monastery, Bogoyavlensky, dating back to the late 17th century, right in the early Romanov period.
And inside the Kremlin itself.
Even more direct evidence, they claim. They point to orders given by Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, one of the early Romanovs, to mercilessly destroy the ancient frescoes in 2 major Kremlin cathedrals, Arkangelsky, Archangel Michael, and Uspensky, Dormition.
Destroyed, not just painted over.
Destroyed and replaced with new ones painted in the Romanov era. They contrast this with a 3rd cathedral, Blagofeshchensky Annunciation, where older frescoes were apparently just covered up, which they see as less suspicious.
Why destroy the others? What might have been on those frescoes?
They imply those frescoes must have contained images or narratives that contradicted the Romanov version of history, perhaps depicting scenes or rulers from the horde period they wanted to erase. They also link this destruction to the burning of old genealogical records and the purging of libraries around the same time, often under the pretext of Patriarch Nikon's church reforms.
A coordinated campaign of erasure, in their view. And this extended to the royal tombs themselves in the Arkangelsky Cathedral.
Yes, the burial place of many pre-Romanov rulers. They claim the original white stone sarcophagi were covered up in the 17th century by brick constructions built by the first Romanovs.
Covered up. Why?
To alter the historical record, they argue. This process, they say, led to blatant inconsistencies in the tomb inscriptions.
Like what?
Things like different titles being used for the same ruler on the original sarcophagus, if visible, versus the later brick casing. For example, Pious Prince versus the grander Great Prince and Lord of all Russia.
Okay.
Or conflicting information altogether. They cite the Staritsky grave, where the brick headstone apparently indicates one person buried, but a later copper casing mentions 2 people. For them, these aren't minor errors. They're signs of deliberate manipulation.
And wasn't there a strange fresco found in Ivan the Terrible's burial vault?
Yes, another anomaly they highlight. A fresco depicting Vasily III, Ivan's father, was found relatively intact inside Ivan V's vault. But Vasily III is actually buried quite far away in the same cathedral.
So why would his portrait be prominently featured in Ivan's private vault?
It's puzzling in the standard view. Fomenko and Nosovsky might see it as a remnant, hinting at different relationships or arrangements than the official history records, something that survived the purge.
So if they covered up old tombs, did they also create fake ones?
That's exactly what they argue happened with the tombs of the pre-Romanov tsarinas, the female rulers and royals. These are located in the basement of the Arkangelsky Cathedral.
And what's wrong with them?
Fomenko and Nosovsky describe these sarcophagi as looking completely different from what they consider authentic ones. Instead of being solid stone slabs, they're apparently made of just bits and pieces of stone held together by copper rods or brackets, all plastered over to look like solid coffins.
So, cheaply made, possibly fakes.
That's their conclusion. They believe the Romanovs used cheap, maybe anonymous coffins, or perhaps defaced existing ones they found, and repurposed them to create a physical body of evidence for their new fallacious history and lineage.
Creating a fake royal ancestry, essentially.
Precisely, and they claim to have found another piece of evidence for this forgery, a hidden change in burial customs.
How so?
They say their research uncovered a significant shift in Russian royal burial rituals, specifically in the shape of sarcophagi that happened very quickly between 1632 and 1637.
A shift from what to what?
From the older anthropomorphic style shaped vaguely like a human body to plain rectangular sarcophagi.
And why is this important?
Because, they claim, this major reform is completely unmentioned in Romanov-era historical accounts.
They just glossed over it. Why would they do that?
Fomenko and Nosovsky see it as a deliberate omission. Why? To conceal the fact that they were creating forgeries, they point to examples like the sarcophagus of Tsarina Theodosia, which is of the new rectangular type, but is dated before 1632, the supposed cutoff date for the old style.
So the physical style of the coffin contradicts its official date, suggesting the date is fake.
Exactly. It screams forgery to them, evidence that the Romanovs were backdating these new style coffins to make it look like the rectangular style was used much earlier, thus hiding the sudden change in their alleged fabrications.
This idea of faking physical evidence extends to ordinary headstones too, right? Something about recycling.
Yes, based on archaeological excavations at Lusetsky Monastery near Moscow in 1999-2000.
What did they find?
They apparently found that huge numbers of old headstones had been removed from cemeteries in the 17th century and weren't just discarded, but were actually reused as construction material, often shipped or broken in the process.
Okay, reusing materials isn't that unusual, maybe.
But they contrast the craftsmanship. They say headstones definitively dated to the Romanov era show high-quality lettering that stylistically matches the decorative ornaments on the stone. Consistent work.
And the allegedly older ones?
The ones they suspect are forgeries, perhaps old stones with new pre-Romanovian dates added, or newly made stones meant to look old show a mismatch. They have professional-looking carved ornaments, but the inscriptions, the epitaphs themselves, look crude, like they were hastily scratched on by someone unskilled.
A mismatch between the decoration and the text.
Right. They interpret this as evidence of hurried, unprofessional forgery, an attempt to quickly create a stock of ancient-looking headstones with counterfeit pre-Romanov dates.
Why? What would be the point?
To prove continuity, to create the impression that burial customs and styles were consistent before and after the Romanovs came to power, again, covering up the breaks and changes they were actually introducing. It's about manufacturing a seamless historical narrative right down to the graveyard.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. We've talked about physical objects, maps, cities. How does the new chronology tackle famous historical texts? Let's start with Plano Carpini's Journey to Mongolia again. This is a foundational text for medieval history.
It is, and Fomenko and Nosovsky take a radical approach to it. First, they argue that the version we have today isn't the original. They claim it's a very late edition, probably edited heavily in the 17th or 18th century.
Edited why?
To make it fit the conventional Scaligeran chronology, they suggest the original true text was likely destroyed as part of that historical cleanup operation they describe.
So they're reading the text we have as potentially corrupted.
Yes, and they find numerous elements in it that, for them, just don't make sense if Carpini actually traveled to modern-day Mongolia in the Gobi Desert. They see these as clues pointing to the text's alteration, or, alternatively, supporting their relocation of Mongolia to Russia.
What kind of elements? You mentioned the route earlier.
Exactly. The implausible route is a major one. Carpini's return journey seems to magically skip over huge swaths of Central Asia. It goes almost directly from Karakorum, the supposed Mongol capital.
Which they place in the Gobi.
Right. From there, he somehow arrives quickly in Poland, Bohemia, and then Italy. Fomenko and Nosovsky argued this makes zero geographical sense for a starting point in Mongolia.
But it would make sense
If Karakorum wasn't in the Gobi at all, but was actually in Russia. Specifically, they suggest it was Yaroslavl, their candidate for Novgorod the Great, which they interpret as meaning the Tsar's abode or great city. From Yaroslavl, a journey west to Poland and Bohemia is geographically logical.
And they stress that no definitive capital matching Carpini's description has been found in the Gobi Desert.
Correct. A major archaeological problem for the standard interpretation, but not for theirs.
What about descriptions of the land itself, the neighbors?
That's another key point. Carpini describes Mongolia's neighbors. China to the east, the Saracens, Muslim lands to the south, the Naimans or Normans to the west, and an ocean to the north.
How does that fit?
It fits Yaroslavl or European Russia perfectly. China is east, across Siberia, Saracens and Ottomans are south, Normans, Europeans are west, and the Arctic Ocean is north. It absolutely does not fit the geography of modern Mongolia, which is landlocked and bordered by Russia and China.
The climate description, too, you mentioned the hailstorm.
Yes, the bizarre story of 160 people drowning in a hailstorm in the middle of the supposedly stony and dry desert Gobi. They call it preposterous.
How do they reinterpret it?
They suggest it wasn't a hailstorm in a desert, but more likely a description of a sudden, severe flood caused by an overflowing river in the Russian plains. Much more plausible geographically.
Okay, geography, climate. What about other details? Graveyards.
Carpini mentions two significant graveyards. One is the Imperial Mongolian graveyard, supposedly filled with gold and silver. The other is a mass grave containing the bodies of multitudes slain during the Mongol invasion of Hungary.
And these haven't been found in the Gobi.
No trace, apparently. But Fomenko and Nosovsky argue that if Mongolia was Russia, these locations become plausible. They point to the numerous ancient burial mounds, or kurgans, found across southern Russia and Ukraine, some known to contain rich grave goods as possible candidates for the imperial graveyard. And a mass grave from the Hungarian campaign could easily be located somewhere in Eastern Europe or Western Russia.
What about the descriptions of Mongol dwellings? The famous felt tents, the yurts.
Ah, yes, Carpini describes these tents, or ordu, as being enormous, capable of housing over 2,000 people, made of white felt, and having gilded poles.
Seems hard to reconcile with a portable yurt.
Exactly. Fomenko and Nosovsky offer a completely different interpretation. They suggest ordu or sheftyur tent might be related to chateau castle, and that voiluk felt might be a misinterpretation or corruption of block, as in stone block.
So the felt tents were actually stone buildings.
Stone castles or palaces, perhaps large whitewashed cathedrals with gilded domes. They specifically mention Moscow's Ouspensky Assumption Cathedral as a possible match, especially since Carpini describes the Khan's inauguration happening on Assumption Day. It fits their narrative of the Mongols being settled, sophisticated rulers, not nomads in tents.
And the throne. You mentioned the Russian craftsman.
Right. Carpini explicitly states that the great Khan's magnificent ivory throne was made by a Russian goldsmith named Kazima.
How do they use that detail?
They contrast the lack of any such discovered throne in Mongolia with the fact that Ivan the Terrible's actual ivory throne still exists in the Moscow Armory Museum. For them, this suggests the tradition of ornate ivory thrones was Russian, part of the horde culture, not something unique to faraway Mongols. Kazima being Russian reinforces this.
And the people around the Khan, the courtiers.
This is crucial for their identity argument. They emphasize that Carpini repeatedly mentions the presence of Russian clerics, or Christian clerics, in the Khan's immediate circle, participating in ceremonies.
Which contradicts the idea of a pagan Mongol court.
Fundamentally, it strongly supports their claim that the Mongols were actually Orthodox Russians, or at least part of a shared Christian culture within the horde.
And didn't they connect Genghis Khan to a Christian saint?
Yes, they equate the reverence shown to an effigy of Genghis Khan, which Carpini describes the Mongols worshipping, with the widespread Russian veneration of St. George the Victorious. St. George icons are ubiquitous in Russia, often depicting him slaying a dragon, a symbol of power. They see this as the same phenomenon viewed through different cultural lenses.
So Carpini's text becomes evidence for their theory, not against it, once reinterpreted.
That's their argument, yes. They apply a similar lens to other texts, too, like the Notes of a Janissary.
By Konstantin Mikhailovich from Ostrovitsa. What's the issue there?
Well, the text itself notes it was initially set in Russian letters in the year 1400 AD, or maybe 1500 AD. They allow for a possible centenary and chronological shift, a common theme in their work.
What's strange about that?
Mainstream historians find several things puzzling. First, why Russian letters were being used by a Serbian author writing about Ottoman service. Second, the author seems clearly Christian, but displays incredibly intimate knowledge of Islamic faith and practices, even commanding a Muslim garrison at one point. It seems contradictory.
How does the new chronology resolve this?
Within their framework of a once unified Orthodox-Islamic horde, these aren't contradictions. A Christian author knowing Islam intimately, using Russian script, which they see as the language of the horde, it all fits their model of blurred cultural and religious lines before the later schisms.
And there's a geographical issue, too.
Yes, what critics call a scandalous geographical blunder. The text has the Euphrates River flowing into the Black Sea. The real Euphrates flows into the Persian Gulf.
Big mistake.
But Fomenko and Nosovsky suggest Euphrates might have been an old name for the Prut River, which is a tributary of the Danube and does ultimately flow into the Black Sea. Problem solved within their system.
Okay. And one last detail from this section, an icon.
Yes, just a visual point they include. A 15th century icon called the Praying People of Novgorod. They highlight that it depicts both men and women wearing braids.
Why is that significant?
It suggests braids weren't just a female hairstyle, but a common Russian custom for both sexes back then. Another small detail challenging standard assumptions and adding texture to their picture of this older Russian horde culture.
We've spent a lot of time exploring Fomenko and Nosovsky's claims and interpretations. Now we really need to circle back to the mainstream response. You mentioned it's overwhelmingly critical.
Extremely so. The academic consensus is firm. New chronology is pseudo-history, not valid scholarship.
Let's break down the specific criticisms of their methodology again. You mentioned the selective sourcing.
Right. Critics accuse Fomenko of essentially, quote, mining history, picking out isolated details or texts that seem to support his case while ignoring the enormous weight of evidence, archaeological, textual, linguistic, that confirms the standard chronology.
And the pattern matching. Statistical analysis.
That's seen as deeply flawed. The claim is that his statistical correlations, like matching lengths of reigns or occurrences of events across different dynasties, are very rough. They argue he achieves these matches only by heavily manipulating the data, by arbitrarily rearranging sequences, merging distinct historical periods or rulers, removing inconvenient data points, or even, as mentioned, combining totally unrelated figures like Jesus and Pope Gregory VII into a single data point to force a pattern.
So the mathematical proof is disputed because the input data is seen as rigged.
Precisely. Garbage in, garbage out, essentially.
What about their astronomical arguments? They claim that's hard science.
That's been specifically challenged, too. Critics point out, for example, that Fomenko's dating of the Almagest, Ptolemy's star catalog, relies on an arbitrarily selected subset of stars, not the whole catalog. And they also cite errors in his calculations regarding things like the Earth's obliquity, the tilt of its axis, which is crucial for accurate historical astronomy.
Is there astronomical evidence supporting the standard timeline?
Absolutely. Mainstream scientists and historians point to a wealth of dated astronomical records that consistently corroborate conventional chronology. Things like Babylonian astronomical diaries recorded on cuneiform tablets, which provide precise data going back centuries BCE.
And eclipse records.
Yes, studies like those by F.R. Stevenson analyzing hundreds of reliably dated solar and lunar eclipse observations from ancient and medieval sources. These provide very strong, independent confirmation of the standard timeline, stretching back to at least 600 BCE, completely contradicting Fomenko's drastic shortening of history.
Okay, what about the dating methods Fomenko dismisses, like carbon dating and tree rings?
Mainstream archaeologists and scientists robustly defend these methods. They argue Fomenko fundamentally misrepresents how dendrochronology, tree ring dating, and radiocarbon dating work, their precision, and their cross-validation.
How so?
Dendrochronology, for instance, provides continuous year-by-year sequences going back over 12,000 years in some regions. Carbon dating has been refined over decades, uses internationally agreed calibration curves to account for past fluctuations in atmospheric carbon-14, and is constantly checked against other methods. They say Fomenko ignores all this calibration and refinement, presenting an outdated or inaccurate picture of these techniques to dismiss them.
So the scientific and archaeological communities stand firmly behind the conventional dating methods.
Overwhelmingly so. They see Fomenko's rejection of these methods not as scientifically sound critique, but as necessary for his theory to even get off the ground. He has to discredit them.
Which brings us back to that underlying issue, the conspiracy theory allegation. What exactly are critics saying Fomenko's theory requires us to believe?
It fundamentally requires believing in a deliberate, systematic, and incredibly successful conspiracy to falsify almost all of recorded world history before about 1600 AD.
Who would have done this, according to the theory's implications?
The alleged culprits are primarily 16th and 17th century Western European scholars, humanists, and clergy people like Joseph Scaliger, who developed the conventional chronology, and Dionysius Batavius. The theory implies they, along with political powers like the Vatican and later the Romanovs, fabricated vast amounts of historical documents, created phantom dynasties, and systematically destroyed any genuine records that contradicted their new timeline.
All for political reasons.
Yes, to legitimize certain power structures, religious narratives, and national histories, while erasing the memory of the supposed global Russian horde empire. It's a conspiracy of almost unimaginable scale and efficiency.
So we've journeyed through this really complex, definitely challenging landscape of the new chronology. It's a theory that turns conventional history, especially Russian history, completely on its head.
Absolutely. From claiming Yaroslavl was Novgorod, to Astrakhan vanishing, to reinterpreting Carpini's Mongols as Orthodox Russians, to finding alleged forgeries in Kremlin tombs and ancient maps. Fomenko and Nosovsky, based on the source material, present an incredibly detailed, albeit radically different, story of the past.
And while mainstream academia, as we've discussed, firmly rejects these ideas, labeling them pseudo-history.
The sheer volume of anomalies, inconsistencies, and reinterpretations that Fomenko and Nosovsky compiled does make you pause and think. It forces you to confront how historical narratives are built and how easily, perhaps, they could be questioned.
It really does. And this deep dive, focusing just on the material from their Book 14 about Russian Tartary, leaves us with a pretty significant question, doesn't it?
I think so.
In today's world, with so much information swirling around, how do we actually figure out what the facts of history are? And maybe more importantly, how willing are we, really, to question the foundations of what we've always believed to be true about the past?
It's a critical question.
Thinking back on everything we've unpacked today from Fomenko and Nosovsky's perspective, what specific claim or reinterpretation stands out most to you, our listener? What was the most surprising, the most thought-provoking thing we uncovered? And does it make you look differently at any other part of history you thought you knew?